with our three distinguished panelists and speakers. Our first speaker will be Lina Benmhani. We are very happy to have her. She is an assistant lecturer at Tunisia University. She's also a very famous blogger. Activist, cyber activist, right? And she's running one of the most famous bloggers dealing with the Arab Spring or Arab Uprising or Arab Awakening issues, which is called A Tunisian Girl. She's a teaching assistant in linguistics at the Faculty of Human and Social Sciences at Tunis University. She, after some unrest, she in December 2010, she had traveled across the country to take photos and videos of the protests and of people, who were attacked by the police forces. And she has also reported for many websites and TV news channels like France 24, Al Jazeera English, and so on. Thanks very much, Lina. So I leave the floor. And
good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me here to speak about Tunisia. Well, my presentation is entitled Online Activism and Arab Spring, and I focus on the Tunisian experience. I'm not going to speak from the point of view of an academic, but from the point of view of the blogger that I am. Okay, so just after the ouster of the dictator Zine El Abidine Ben Ali from Tunisia on the 14th of January 2011, and with the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring, people all over the globe started to talk about a Facebook revolution, Twitter revolution, or 2.0 revolution. They shed light on the crucial role of bloggers and cyber activists in the eviction of the despot. It was said that the youth who were longing for a total rupture with the old governance, which marginalized them and drove them away from public action, for several generations succeeded in toppling at least two regimes, both the Tunisian and the Egyptian, with recourse to information and communication technologies. So, what is the part of truth in such claims? What was the role played by internet and online activists in the Arab uprisings in general, and in the Tunisian revolution in particular? What's the role of the internet after the ouster of the dictators? And did online activists succeed in using internet to fulfill democratic transitions? I will start by talking about the background of the Tunisian revolution and the role of online activism under the regime of the dictator Ben Ali. Then I'll tackle the role of online activism during the uprising. And finally, I'll talk about the role of online activism or cyber activism after the ouster of the dictator. Online activism before the ousting of the dictator. For more than half a century, my country didn't know more than two presidents. Both of those presidents were forced to leave office. When the events started, Tunisians didn't only live in a very difficult economic and social situation caused by the spread of mafia practices and aggravated by corruption and nepotism, but they were also prevented. Prevented from expressing themselves freely. They had to live both in fear and misery. I allow myself to point out that these causes can be summarized by the slogan that was chanted the most during the glorious days of December 2010 and January 2011: work, freedom, and dignity. The online fight for freedom of speech, freedom, and dignity started years before the 17th of December 2010. In fact, at the time, and in a media landscape that was characterized by its lack of diversity and the fact of being dominated by the tenors of the dictatorial regime, then blogs and social networks, mainly Facebook and Twitter, played two important roles. First, they gradually became the most reliable and well-fed, if not the unique source of information. Second, they represented an essential and effective tool for online mobilization. When the dictator and his regime were working to muzzle Tunisians and silence them, Youth defied them using these new tools to break the wall of silence and unveil the truth. Long before December the 17th, 2010, and of course here I am talking of the date of the self-immolation by the fire of Mohamed Bouazizi and Sidi Bouzid, online activists conducted online campaigns that deeply embarrassed the autocratic regime. These campaigns were mainly meant to support opinion and political prisoners, advocating for freedom of speech and denouncing censorship, and also to support some Tunisians who choose to break the silence and who revolt before December 2010. And here I'm showing some examples. This is a collective blog against censorship of websites and blogs in Tunisia. It is from the year 2009. Here is another collective blog claiming the liberation of jailed Tunisian students jailed for their opinions. And here is another campaign to support the prisoners of the mining basin in the Tunisian south. It is a social movement that started in 2008. And here are the martyrs from that movement. Okay. Sorry. Nevertheless, the turning point was the demonstration against censorship organized on May 22nd, 2010. I'm saying a turning point because this demonstration allowed the online activism to meet the real world. It paved the way to other actions in real life and reopened the streets for protesters. Online activists left their screens and keyboards and challenged authorities on the ground. They convinced people to take to the streets through the use of irony, humor, videos, songs, and different peaceful means of action. Thus, we can say that internet and online activism didn't uniquely allow the dissemination of information in a context characterized by a blackout on the information and the absence of freedom of speech, but it also served as a catalyst and an agent of mobilization for concrete actions. Online activism presented a threat to the regime. This is why it had recourse not only to censorship, but also to the arrest and the imprisonment of some cyber activists who had to pay the price for their commitment. I mention here Zuhair Yahyaoui, who was the first cyber dissident to be pursued and condemned in Tunisia, and we call him the martyr of internet. Actually, he had been tortured and badly treated in prison, and he died just after his release of a heart attack. And here is another example. She's Fatma Riahi Arabica. She's a blogger who had been arrested for 7 days in 2009, and here is a campaign to ask for her release. To sum up, online activism in Tunisia started long before the revolution. From the late 1990s, online activists used internet as a tool of context and protest and expression. In the beginning, online activists used forums and blogs to share their ideas and opinions and to denounce the wrongs of the regime, human rights violations, cases of censorship, and they had been always tracked by the cyber police. They had to face censorship, assaults, and arrests too. Nevertheless, the impact of the online activism movement remained relatively limited, as it was mainly linked to blogs with a limited audience and easily censored. One of the important stages of the online activism movement had been the transition from online activism to real-world activism through a demonstration against censorship organized on May 22, 2010. Progressively, online activists, mainly bloggers, started to use social networks to disseminate their ideas and organize online campaigns to support a plethora of causes. And now, the second part, the role of online activism during the Tunisian revolution. Online activists succeeded in showing that young Tunisians could challenge the regime and its oppressive forces. The youth offered their bare chests to the bullets and truncheons of the repressive forces. They inhaled the tear gas and slept on the public squares. Moreover, many of them mastered computer skills and new technologies of information and managed to go through the threats of the wall of silence and the leaden shroud that muzzled our country for decades. They also organized protest actions widely shared on social media and widely relayed by international media at a time when even foreign journalists couldn't access the country. Some online activists traveled the country to cover live protest movements and show to the world that the situation in Tunisia was really critical. Several of them had been arrested in the beginning of January 2011. Later on, the regime admitted the role of online activism. But the ouster of Ben Ali happened thanks to those women, men, the young and the old alike, and those who defied their fear and faced the arbitrary violence and repression of the security forces. The presence on the ground, demonstrations, marches, and sit-ins of hundreds of thousands of Tunisians made the regime wobble. There were more than 300 martyrs. Women and men sacrificed their lives for freedom's sake. And this actually happened in real life and not online. It is true that internet played an important role, but that role had been exaggerated. We don't have to forget that access to internet remains limited in Tunisia. According to Internet World States, the number of internet users was estimated to 3,600,000 for a total population of 11 million inhabitants. The number of Facebook users was estimated to 16,000 users in the beginning of 2008 to reach 1,800,000 in January 2011. Online activists were successful in generating revolutionary content that they distributed to their online networks, as well as to their families, friends, and people they know. The usually evoked conflict between traditional mass media and online media gave way to collaboration and complementarity, which leads us to think of the complementary roles of traditional mass media and social media. And now the last part, the role of online activism in Tunisia after the ouster of the dictator. After a few months of revolutionary euphoria, Tunisians realized and understood that toppling a dictator, however, is only the first step. This is why different demonstrations and sit-ins were held after the ouster of Ben Ali, and the majority of people used social media to mobilize their compatriots and invite them to support their causes. Moreover, and as mentioned earlier, many experts, researchers, journalists, and politicians around the world focused on the role of online activism in the Tunisian revolution and in the outbreak of different revolutionary movements in the Middle East and in other parts of the world. We all remember movements like Occupy movement in different parts of the world and the Indignant movement in Spain. Online activists and bloggers were glorified and gained notoriety. This focus on the role of ICTs and online activism and the illusion of infinite power that was linked to them was tempting for the majority of political parties and for the civil society too. Some political parties were so focused on gaining surface on the net to till a point where they forgot about the field work. The miraculous tool became a double-edged sword, like you said yesterday. Okay. Progressively, online activism landscape changed importantly after the collapse of the previous Ben Ali regime. Some online activists who were committed and devoted to the cause of their country, as well as an important number of young people, became the lackeys, using their knowledge for the sake of political parties. And unfortunately, clashes between different political parties and ideologies invaded the net. Tunisians overestimated the role of social networks and forgot that they had to combine real actions and online actions to achieve their goals. This is why we can feel the big gap between the number of online protesters and those who are really present on the ground. And here is an example. It is a call for a demonstration on Facebook. We can see that on Facebook there are at least 1,000 persons who said that they are going to take part in the demonstration, and this is a photo I took during the demonstration. There are less than 20 persons. So people think that they can change things just by clicking on like on Facebook, but this is not true. Another alarming fact today is the invasion of internet by terrorists. So some people started to want to have recourse to censorship, but online activists don't see it as the right solution, and the debate is still ongoing right now in Tunisia. And to conclude, for years, the militant and activist uses of internet helped in breaking the authoritarian configuration of the public space. During the Tunisian revolution, the internet, and in particular the social networking platform Facebook, had been widely used by Tunisians to circumvent censorship and to face the regime propaganda that dominated the traditional media. Despite the fact that the use of internet for protest purposes in Tunisia was not new and has steadily developed since the late 1990s, the significance of such a use during the Tunisian revolution and then in other Arab countries turned it into an object of interest, now considered as fully legitimate. As it was demonstrated earlier, internet and online activism played a crucial role in the Tunisian revolution. Nevertheless, we don't have to forget that internet is just a tool. It's not an autonomous actor. Other factors are important to achieve the change. After the liberation of the public space, online activism is supposed to play another role, that of building a functional public space leading to the building of democracy. Some people are using it in the right way, others are not. Moreover, we have to keep in mind that the use of social media tools like text messaging, emails, photo and video sharing, blogs, social networking doesn't have a single preordained outcome. The failure of the Iranian Green Movement or also the outcomes of the Syrian revolution are good examples of the arbitrariness of the efficiency of the information and communication technologies and online activism. And thanks for your attention.
Thanks so much, Lina. Thanks twice for your brilliant presentation and for not exceeding 20 minutes. So thanks very much. Our second contributor is a dear friend of mine, Mathieu Rey. He's a French historian coming from the Collège de France. He's an assistant professor. His dissertation was about, it was a study basically of Iraqi and Syrian parliamentary experience in the 20th century, more precisely after 1946. No? So he's going to talk about online activism and the Syrian war. Basically, he will discuss, the issue of counter-revolution activism, cyber activism from the Assad regime, and we are very delighted to listen to him. So, 20 minutes. Thanks.
It's a pleasure to be back in Singapore after spending some time here and to talk about this great issue, which is electronic war. Contrary to other countries, these few sentences just draw the backgrounds of the Syrian context. Contrary to the utopia of internet use, in 2012, activists just discovered that it may become a tool of destructions. This activist, this was a friend very afraid of any kinds of electronic tools, as many of the other activists were already arrested. But these few sentences describe the Syrian opinions toward the use of internet during the revolution. They highlight the immediate difference with Egyptians or Tunisians' experiments. Indeed, during 2011, the first narrative we were hear about those revolutions was you just have to use internet, social media, and you will down the dictator. The overthrow of Ben Ali and then Mubarak shows both the Arab world and the analysis of the recent trends which animate its public opinions. There were new heroes, those heroes were the cyber activists. But in Syria, the reality was a bit different. To understand this, I will try to pinpoint a few different aspects of how internet was used and what was the daily life of internet user and the counter-revolutions that they have to face. For this, I will use a couple of theoretical stints. First, if I'm using Hasabo works, we can understand the revolution as a rocky path between institutional approach on the one hand, and on the other hand, revolutionary trends, which means that new people started to use new tools, new practices in order to shake a regime, and on the other hand, the state defend itself by all the tools it will use. In the Syrian cases, we can analyze the electronic war as part of the institutional processes. Mary Douglas say that if we are considering the different institutions and their outcomes, we may consider them as thinkings or actors. If we consider the electronic war, it may be possible to understand better how Syrian institutions were working. And it's important as it's very hard to get inside those institutions. Erwin Goffman just reminded us that framing the reality is part of the reality, and internet took a part in this, as the great conflict was how to build a narrative on the daily life. If you can prove that there was a revolution and not a plot, that you can succeed in making revolutions. And that was part of the fights from the different cyber activists in Syria. And finally, Paul and DiMaggio tell that the different fight between institutions built the public policies. And I will argue that if we consider in all the respect we can have, the counter-revolutions, electronic counter-revolutions, we may consider it as ordinary public policies. It's built between the dialogues of different institutions and the dialogues and the difference and the conflicts between them. Therefore, I will assess that contrary to Yevgeny Morozov, who describes Iranians' events during 2009 as a net delusions, which means that internet just was turned into a coercive tool. Syrian events were not exactly in the same framework. Indeed, when the revolution started, the regime was not aware how to use internet, how to tackle all the different aspects. And during the revolution and those events, he learned slowly how to do it. To understand this, we have to go back before the revolutions, and I will follow more or less the same path than Lina, going behind 211s, what's happening in 211s, and then seeing how we've got a new approach after 211 by the regime. So first of all, how was important internet before the revolutions? At the beginning of the 21st century, the new president Bashar al-Assad took power. The new young president with blue eyes, as most of the Syrians called him at that time, had been head of the Syrian computer company since the mid-90s. So he was the first responsible to bring computer, internet, new technology inside Syria. It was both for him a tool to rise to power and a tool to control his society. But I think it's important to notice these connections to the computer sphere, as most of the responsible of the Syrian institutions until 2012, 2013 belonged to these very small groups. As we can see on this graph, there is a turning point around 2005 as the growth toward using internet increased a lot. But it remained very low comparing to other countries. If we compare to Tunisia, in Tunisia, when the revolution starts, almost a fifth of the population get connections to internet. We are not speaking about using Facebook or Twitter, just connecting to internet. In Syria, it started to grow slowly through the end of the 2010. So that's the first difference. But the difference is also a national difference, because those percentages are considering the whole Syria, but most of the user was in Damascus or in Aleppo. And if we are following the works of Delshad Osman, which is one of the most important Syrian activists based nowadays in Washington, D.C., who describe in 2011 how to break down the different tools used by the regime in order to use internet freely, he showed in a very complete report that the regime organized geographic distributions of internet, which means that the two capitals, Damascus and Aleppo, get some privilege to get an access to, but other parts of Syria don't have. Therefore, when we are considered cyber activists, we are speaking about urban cyber activists living mostly in the two capitals and got what I will call a very great gap with other Syrians. And I will now focus more on the situations in Aleppo. Indeed, Aleppo was a kind of hub. Contrary to Damascus, the control of the regime was a bit less, as it was not the political capital. And one of key institutions for the revolutions became the University of Aleppo. But during the 2000s, this institution started to gather different components of the populations. That's just two interviews conducted in Damascus, for one in 2012 and the other one in Gaziantep in 2014, as it was not anymore possible to enter Syria for particular reason. What they said is that there was already informal political activities in Syria. I mean, before the revolution, people started to organize for other purposes than making a revolution. It may be just gathering money to pay your rent, which means that you will have some connection between the students in a country which forbid any kinds of meetings more than 5 people. And in these different groups, Aleppo University was very important because students all around the country might meet in this place, which means that students from Dera, students from Homs can meet there and can organize very social practices on the daily life. And there started to build a group which will turn to be the free students during the revolutions. They started to know each other just because they need one to another in the university. They show that finally internet was a way for, on the fringe, a part of the population to connect one to another through specific institutions. But of course, we are not speaking of the majority of the Syrian. We are speaking of, I will call, a great minority, but an important one. Let's turn to 2011. February 2011, suddenly one of my friends who should be there, but unfortunately was ill at the time, entered a room saying, "Come to see that. There is a demonstrations in Damascus." That was a bit amazing for everybody. We heard about Tunisia, we heard about Egypt, but nobody in the street will speak about politics and anything like this. And suddenly we can see some demonstration on YouTube. In 2011, to counter the process and to counter what kind of uprising, President Assad just decided to allow Facebook, YouTubes, Twitters, everything. It was already used by people, but it was used through proxy. Allowing those different media led the regime to get an access. As some Mukhabarat will say later on, therefore we can have an access to all Syrian private life. They just drop all the information, we can collect them. That was the beginning of the counter-revolution through internet processes. Let me quote another activist to understand how the process was going on and what part of internet play in it. To put in the context, Homs knew a very important sitting in 18 April 2011. Maybe 20,000 of people gathered one night in the main square. They want to recreate the Tahrir Square in Homs. At 1 a.m., Mukhabarat arrive on the place and they say, "You've got 1 hour," and then we open fire. They open fire after 200 people dead. People decide that they have to go back home. At 6 a.m., they have cleaned the square. Nothing's happened officially. So let me quote this activist I've interviewed in Lebanon. the regime launched massive attacks. The sitting was broken on the first night. Then we took refuge in our quarter. Each neighborhood became the main stage of the protest of February, but quickly it became impossible to move from one part to another. We knew from younger activists who knew how to use internet that other parts of Syria were involved in the protest. So at the very beginning of the revolutions, internet was just a way for the minority to say to the majority who were in the street, you are not alone, but quickly. This gave us some hope, but quickly we lost electricity connections, we were cut from the world. From June 2011 until my departure in March 2012, it became really hard to know what was going on outside the neighborhood. This assesses exactly the role of internet. On the one hand, it was a great punch for the people and so on. But on the other hand, very quickly, the regime found a way to curb all kinds of use. First one was to cut electricity, which is the best thing to do if you don't want anybody to use internet. Then to control all kinds of flow of internet. The turning point may be summer 2011. In summer 2011, cyber activists from Anonymous organized a massive attack around all kinds of public websites. This led Assad's regime to discover that internet might be great advertising or might be a way to advertise on the revolution. At that time, the only propaganda was there's nothing happening in the country, maybe little troubles, but it's just terrorists who organize them. If the Anonymous can brought the proof that something happening, it became dangerous. Therefore, Mukhabarat turned their policy toward arresting massively all kinds of cyber activists. They mostly targeted all the civil society activists which belong to the local civil committee. In the local civil committee, in order to provide information and news, they organize some special departments to provide the news and to organize their spread. During summer 2011 until December 2011, most of the cyber activists were arrested or invited to leave the country, which means that Mukhabarat on the border did not take care about identity if they know that this one was a cyber activist, or they take him and all his family. Therefore, they destroy part of the infrastructure for organizing the information from the revolutions. Only the jihadist people will live on the ground, because it might be useful maybe for Assad to keep jihadists in Syria. On the other hand, slowly, as recent studies show us, the regime learned how to use internet. Julia Prati has studied how Assad, House of Assad, has used Twitter since 2011 until nowadays. And Prati shows that at the very beginning, very small details, Assad was always tweet on the Syrian times, which means that he was tweeting between 10 to 11, which is in the US between 2 and 3 a.m. So nobody can reproduce your Twitter on CNN at a good time. But nowadays, he knows how to tweet. So he will tweet on the good times for American public opinions, European public opinion, and so on. So in 4 years, the president or the services, electronic services of the president has learned that if you know how to use electronic tools, you may provide the good narrative for the world. That is to say, nowadays, Assad regime is still alive mostly because he built the only legitimate narrative that the people can listen to. And he used internet on a double level. On one level, he provides just basic information, I'm still running the country and so on. And on the other hand, it creates a kind of dark picture of the country where you don't know exactly what's happening on. If you're looking on the grounds from other information, Assad regime might control nowadays just the capital. But through internet, he might say, I'm the sovereign president, I'm the legitimate one, so I can continue to rule the states. Therefore, he'll receive through internet some sovereignty effect, which is you can build some alliance from outside and so on. The other part of this electronic war was the so-called electronic Syrian army. This was not a department of the Syrian regime. It was more local initiative from some of the activists in favor of the regime. But as always Assad done, is just labelize those activists as legitimate and good people in favor of the regime, which shows the double processes that we are witnessing since the beginning in the revolutions in Syria. And I will use Jan Kirsch's works about Hitler regime to describe it. There's no comparison between Nazi regime and Assad regime. It's not my point. It's just to understand how Syrian regime works through the electronic war. There is speak about working toward the chief. The chief decides something. You just have a main goal. You have to defend Syria. Then local activists who for particular reason, family backgrounds and so on, decide to provide some information in favor of the regime. And one day you receive the honor of the president, June 2012, when he declared, I'm in favor of this Syrian electronic army, which is patriot, in favor of the true Syria against those terrorists who are tweeting and Facebook wrong ideas. Therefore, what I try to show is that, contrary to the Iranian example of 2009, Syrian cases show us how internet take part through broader processes. Internet might be used as a key entry to understand how institutions work in an authoritarian regime. And in situations such as Syria, where there is too many events to understand what's going on the ground, internet or the use of internet might be used as a way to bring some broader perspective on 2 or 3 key issues. First, internet belongs to the public outcomes. It integrates institutional works. Second, even if it's chaos nowadays, there is still institution working on the grounds, and internet provide or frame the global narrative for the world. And finally, a part of the struggles nowadays is to struggle on how do you frame the reality between a set of the people who are outside of Syria or inside Syria who are fighting for their freedom, and one regime who just have to say, nothing happened, I'm still legitimate, look, I can tweet that I'm the president. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mathieu, for this very fascinating presentation. Last but not least, we are going to hear now Ivan Panovic, who is an assistant professor at Nanyang's Technological University. He has co-authored the book with Deborah Cameron, working with written discourse, and his presentation will be about cyber activism during the Egyptian revolution in 2011, and he will make some points principally about the fact that if in the political sphere or in the socio-economic spheres counter-revolutionary processes seem to be successful, at least in the field of social linguistics, narratives have changed, and so we are happy to learn from you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Let me just... I have to apologize to the people, to all the participants who came from afar, because I wasn't here yesterday. I had to teach. So although I'm based in Singapore, I'm with you only today. And I want to thank, of course, the organizers for putting up this fantastic conference. I was there for food, of course, yesterday, which was amazing. So I will start this presentation by reading a quote from an article published in The Guardian in 2003, and the author is Niloufer Haeri, who is an anthropologist, Iranian anthropologist who worked on Egypt. And her comment is as follows: today, many in the Arab world are talking about the lack of democracy in their region, but there is little debate about a linguistic situation that makes it hard for political pluralism to flourish. No one except the Arabs themselves can bring democracy to their societies, and for that to happen, there is an urgent need for a language that facilitates open debate and questioning, not least about language itself. But the minority of Arabs who are proficient in classical Arabic continue to claim that everyone understands the language, and so there are no problems. An inclusive and accessible language is essential to freedom of speech, otherwise we continue to spin. So this is Niloufer Hayri referring to the situation that everyone who works in the Arab world is familiar with, the coexistence of standard Arabic that has changed very little since the classical times, and dialects that are natively spoken by people. Of course, many people were against Niloufer Hayri, especially in the Arab world. She was not received very well, even this text and her book Sacred Language, Ordinary People. But this comes from the conclusion of an awarded book awarded by Mesa, written by an Egyptian. They're referring again to this dualism, or diglossia as the term goes, this transnational identity crisis, I submit, will resolve itself only if this cultural and linguistic duality ends with either the absorption of the eventual dominance of one form of the language, absorption or the eventual dominance of one form of the language over the other. So here too we see that the situation is again posited as some kind of dualism. So we have standard Arabic, or Fusha, and then we have colloquial or Ammiya, and that the solution is that either Egyptians should adopt Egyptian colloquial Arabic as their standard language and get rid of Fusha, or that somehow some kind of blending of the two has to happen. That situation in sociolinguistics is referred to as diglossia, whereby these two forms of language also are somehow functionally distributed. So there is a domain for one and there is a domain for another. I will now go okay, I will leave this translingual practice. I'll come to that in a second, and I will just remind you of this artifact, which is the Stone of Rosetta, which is a bilingual triscriptural stone that enabled Champollion to decipher hieroglyphics, reminding us that Egypt may have been multilingual from the time immemorial, and that it's not as simple as some scholars would want us to believe. And what I bring you here is the linguistic resources or semiotic resources that I see functioning in Egypt today that we should take into consideration. And when it comes to linguistic varieties, there is, of course, Standard Arabic, or Fusha, Modern Standard Arabic. There is Egyptian Arabic, or Ammiya, and there is the increasing importance of English. And then with scripts, we have two. We have the Arabic script and we have the Roman script. When we kind of try to plot these things together, what we come up with is this. So what you have there is there are two options for each. So Arabic or Fusha written in Arabic script in its somehow natural position. Fusha written in the Roman alphabet. Egyptians or Arabs usually don't do that. That's what the domain of Orientalists and Arabists. We do that, to transcribe Arabic to those who cannot read the script. Then Ammiya, that could be written in both scripts and feels comfortable at both. The variant where you have Ammiya written in Roman script is usually referred to as by the term Franco or Franco-Arabi in Egypt. In some other parts of the Arab world, it can be called Arabizi. And then we have, of course, English written in Roman script in its natural position, and sometimes English written in Arabic script, which, if you may wonder what it looks like this. As this t-shirt says, shit happens. Shit happens. Okay, so now I go back to translingualism and metrolingualism to introduce this concept, because I also want to wrap up quickly and then just lead you through examples as the time allows me. The concept that I like to play with is the notion of metrolingualism, which is defined as creative linguistic practices across borders of culture, history, and politics. And as such, metrolingualism is a product of modern and often urban interaction, describing the ways in which people of different and mixed backgrounds use, play with, and negotiate identities through language. Another notion that comes from this part of the world by Professor Lionel Wee from NUS and Christopher Stroud in their joint work while Christopher Stroud was still here in Singapore is the notion of sociolinguistic consumption, whereby we should understand languages as some kind of commodities that have values on the market. So, regardless of the fact that many who fight for the Arab unity and the importance of the classical Arabic for the Arab national identity, we have to admit that Fusha has or does not have a particular value on the market anymore. That Egyptian Arabic, of course, is the native tongue to all Egyptians. English is what gets them lucrative jobs. Fusha, I'm not so sure. And it is in this relationship whereby all the sociolinguistic tension should be understood, but not in a sense that, oh, people should kind of abandon one in favor of another. Because now we're going to move to some of the examples, and some of them tangentially touch to the notions of, to the cyber activism and the role of media. But what is important is that this kind of mixing that I will be illustrating here has certain history in the history of Arabic language. We know it from the documents such as which are known as the representing the Middle Arabic or Judeo-Arabic, where you had Arabic written in Hebrew script, whereby, of course, there was always a question of identity, but it was always somehow on the peripheries. It is now, with the proliferation of small publishing houses, with the internet, the growing importance of advertising practices and linguistic creativity that advertisers try to put there, that we see that those ideological boundaries between the standard Arabic and the colloquials are trying to kind of to blur, and we have this mixture that I showed you in the little chart, which of course it's always hard to fix language in charts, and I now work on examples where the mixing happens within one single word in writing, because I'm interested in the sociolinguistics of writing and literacy as a social practice. But those examples I leave for some other presentation. So now I go to something which I call a call to revolution, and this is the text that was published on the famous web page called Facebook page Kullina Khalid Saeed. And unfortunately at my university, in my department, my copier broke down, so I only have like 2 of these handouts. So I'll give one to Dr. Sahar, and then you So what we see this, it's interesting that what you don't have here is like كل ما تريد أن تعرفه عن مظاهرات ثورة يوم 25. Even before the demonstrations, they actually wanted a revolution. This is interesting because we all like to think that it somehow, you know, they called for the demonstrations and then it broke out into revolution. But here in this document, what we see is that there was an idea of coming up with something that had already happened in Tunisia. So the text is quite long, and it has some of the usual kind of sections. من نحن, which is the opening one, which you see here. لماذا نتظاهر? Why? Who are we? Why are we demonstrating? Why this particular day, 25th? What are our demands, and so on and so forth. So as the text moves, you see here what you find in yellow is the Egyptian colloquial. So Egyptian colloquial is interspersed with standard Arabic throughout this document, but in a very interesting pattern. So at this very beginning, we find mostly standard Arabic and just a little bit of colloquial. For the sake of saving time, I will just have to run through this. So those of you who don't know Arabic, come to me later. We'll talk about this. I want to move to this, you see, in the part which says like why 25th of January, where it describes the situation in 1952 when there was this conflict with the British forces and whatever. This is all standard Arabic. It's very solemn and it's very kind of classical language. By moving to the nitty-gritty part of the demands, we see more of colloquial Arabic. By the time it comes to the what to do in the case of, you know, like when you go, the last one of إرشادات is like instructions for demonstrations is ما تنزلش لوحدك. أكرر مهم جدا ما تنزلش لوحدك لأن الأصحاب بيفيدوا في ظروف الدين. That means like do not go alone. Let me repeat, it's very important, do not go alone. It's important to have friends in this situation. So if we are to kind of try to, this is the translation. I'm not expecting you to read, but just to show you, the blue is the standard Arabic, red is the colloquial. This is how the text goes. And here we see, you know, how we can try to understand what is happening there, in a sense that modern standard Arabic is used mostly for general descriptions and explanations, facts, figures, and demands, whereas Egyptian moves into the concrete bits, into discourse organization, emphasis, practicalities. Or, in another way, what and why are predominantly standard Arabic. Who is a little bit of both. I want to introduce myself both as a friend and as authority, but it's predominantly standard Arabic. Whereas where, when, and how is predominantly Egyptian, because it's more kind of concrete. There are references to football stadiums and the rest. Then we move to Midan al-Tahrir, when the whole thing started, and we see coexistence. So I'll just go through these. You know, you see لن نترك حق الشهيد is the standard Arabic juxtaposed to the same kind of font, the same thing in colloquial Arabic, where it says يا أهلنا انضموا لنا الحرية ليكوا ولينا. And we see that throughout many of these banners, people were demonstrating. Then we move into a multilingual bit of demonstrations in Tahrir. And this multimodality was very important, using more semiotic resources. So this guy here, this man says, my eye is not going to go to waste. And he is referencing the fact that a lot of people lost their eyes there. Then we see a شعب يريد إسقاط النظام, which I believe originated in Tunisia and was transposed, it was taken to Egypt. This one is really beautiful. The boy is holding the banner in standard Arabic, and the girl has one in the Egyptian Arabic. So he says اقتلني اقتلني لكن لن تحكمني, and she says شيدي حيلك يا بلد مبارك ماشي للأبد والحرية هتتولد. So these are also some of the more colloquial signs. These are, I hope, some of the people who read Chinese. It says لو مش فاهم عربي غور يا مبارك بالصيني. If you don't understand Arabic, get lost, Mubarak, in Chinese. So there was this strong moment of multimodality. This is after the demonstrations where a concerned Egyptian citizen is writing on the metro that he's giving instructions in Egyptian Arabic about the success of revolution depends on the fact if people will respect how to get off and get on the metro, the trains. This is from Egyptian to Egyptian. Work is our only solution, instructed in English. This is a year after the revolution in Egyptian Arabic, 6th of April movement, calling for the celebration. It's very ironic what they're doing here. Come to celebrate, you know, the success of the revolution 1 year later and showing all the failures. Again, it's appealing to Egyptians. In here we see a little bit of Franco. Aha, everybody knows what aha is. If you don't, come later. I don't want to swear anymore. Here are some of the tweets. I'll pick up this one. The challenge facing us now in Egypt is the gap between the great isn't good enough generation and ليس بالإمكان أفضل مما كان generation. So again, this is definitely directed to someone who knows very well both Arabic and English to understand the second part, which says it can never be better than it used to be generation. So Twitter is full of these examples of mixing various resources, mixing English with Franco. I had a fight with Filul in Tahrir. يقرف, old people should be at their retirement houses and shut the F up, and so on and so forth. And here it is, our English in Arabic. Are you? The question is asked in English. Are you worried about today's religious inclination? To which the other user says never. أنا مستمتع آخر حاجة. I'm highly amused. I'm enjoying it to the fullest. So never is transcribed in English. So we see this transition. And whoever wants to say that Muslim Brotherhood or Islamists would prefer to use classical Arabic, you should see this came into the neighborhood where I lived in Abdin at the time. On the day when Muslim Brotherhood launched their party Al-Hurriya wal-Adala, this is what we found in our neighborhood. مش حرمي زبالة في الشارع. I will not litter in the streets. So it's not لن أرمي القمامة في الشارع. In classical Arabic, like Islamists too can appeal to people by using colloquial. These are some of the books that kind of treat the same topic. This one, both by young Egyptian authors. This one on your left, written entirely in standard Arabic. The other one mixing all the possible resources. Graffiti. It's, of course, the explosion of linguistic creativity. What you see there from Ana Ikhwan, says the giant, I'm brotherhood, and the kid says Aha, Ana Thawra, or Ana Thawra, like fuck off, I'm the revolution. All cops, look at this, ACAB translated, all cops are bastards, is translated, all cops are wilad wescha. You know, it's Franco. No to Khirfan, reference to the supporters of Muslim Brotherhood. Multilingual graffiti, but also these beautiful calligraphic solutions as Ana al-mukh wa enta al-adalat. I'm the brain, you are the muscles. And this is Vodafone, which says هدفنا إن قبل سنة 2017 كل مصري يقدر يقرأ الجملة دي ويكتبها كمان. This is their القوة بين إيديك, like the power is in your hand campaign of bringing literacy to the illiterate. And I heard that someone was talking about the number of illiterate people in Egypt yesterday, that it goes to up to 45%. I don't know how successful Vodafone is going to be with this campaign that was advertised in colloquial Arabic. And for someone like me, I was like super happy, like wow, they're going to educate people to write in the language that they speak and then move to Fusha. No, the actual app that was launched is all in some kind of Fusha that not even professors of Arabic would want to hear on daily basis. But I don't know how successful they're going to be, but they obviously played into this game. So I think yes, so usually people would like to bringing this to a closure, people would like to talk, critics of this situation in the Arab world talk about the decline, about the declining competencies in Arabic language. But what I'm hoping to have shown you here is that we may also be talking about the complexification of literacies, of writing practices that require more and more knowledge. So although they're not maybe favored by some people, by very traditional language purists, what is happening there that you see this combination of classical standard Arabic and the colloquial and English in very creative ways, which could not definitely be achieved in a single way. And I'm moving to my next to last slide to express that, to close by saying that even if there is a counter revolution in one way, this kind of parallel sociolinguistic revolution is moving on. And this is a beautiful graffiti that is it seems as if it's monolingual, but it's multimodal, and it's actually bilingual, because you have to give the elephant the reading in Arabic in order to come to the sentence in English. I don't feel good. And to end on a more positive side, for those of you who like Fairuz, this is the T-shirt that comes with a famous line from her song, and I pay attention to it has 3 words. The third word is realized through the at sign with tanween kasr, and it says al-ghadab al-sati' atin, which means the overwhelming anger is coming. So thank you.
Thanks, Mathieu. Thanks, Ivan. Do you hear me? So, and especially for
delivering your speeches in due time. So now it's time to open the floor for Q&As. I would be happy to have your questions. So I'm sure you have a lot of comments about the three fascinating presentations. So, no question? Yes, please.
Thank you so much to the three of you. Very fascinating presentations. Lina Ben Mahani, I want to tell you that in my latest co-authored book, Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism, you were one of the bloggers that myself and my co-author Mohammed Nawawi had quoted in the book as a significant cyber activist. So I want to really commend you for your role. And you said in your presentation that the role of cyber activism or social media and new media after the ouster of the dictator has to be revisited, and especially you said the potential of these media in terms of creating a public space that would allow the transition to democracy. I would like you to give us maybe a few examples or a few remarks on how and why this may be happening or maybe not happening enough in the post-Ben Ali Tunisia today. So in other words, your reflection on the role of cyber activism after the ouster of Ben Ali and whether it is really successful in creating this public space that helps the transition to democracy or not. And for Matthew, about Syria, I think it's very interesting to talk about the counter-revolution or the cyber war, the tug of war between the regime and the, and the activists or the protesters. But again, after the eruption of the full-blown humanitarian crisis and everything else, it seems to me that there are certain factors in the Syrian society itself and demographic makeup of the society. There are people who are supporters, genuine supporters, I was surprised, of the Assad regime. To add to this, the sectarian strife, the different loyalties, different religious sects, and different political ideologies and affiliations. How far do these factors contribute today to, quote-unquote, the worsening of the Syrian situation and even complicating it further? And what role, if any, can cyber activism play to combat some of these forces? And last but not least, for sure, Ivan, your presentation was beyond fascinating. Putting aside the profanities, but it was very, very exciting. And I want to tell you that I co-authored just recently a study on the role of humor in political activism in the Egyptian revolution. And it would be very interesting to talk more in terms of the sociolinguistic associations with the role of humor in terms of triggering the revolution in Egypt, because some of the protesters in Tahrir Square had very, very funny signs that they held up in Tahrir Square. One activist saying, holding a banner and saying to Mubarak, "Imshi, idi waga'itni," please go away, my hand is hurting, right? And another one says, go away, I want to get married. Another one, my wife is pregnant and the baby doesn't want to see you, So there were all of these usages of really Egyptians are very funny people, in case you don't know. And they become even more humorous and more funny when things get worse. So whenever it gets really, really bad, that's when they become at their funniest mode. And that's what was happening in the heart of Tahrir Square. So maybe you can comment a little bit on the humorous potential of the sociolinguistic fascinating factors that you talked about. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. To whoever wants to answer.
Well, as I explained earlier, the fascinating tool that is internet and social networks has become a double-edged sword. It's true that even today internet and social networks are very helpful. We use them for campaigns to help people, to help in releasing people, because until today people are unfortunately arrested for their opinions, and we can use internet for this even now. But as I explained, political parties understood the power of this tool and succeeded in attracting many young people to do evil using internet. And we have big divisions in Tunisia, and now internet, or this space that used to be a space for freedom of speech under the dictatorship, especially that the case of Tunisia is different from that of Egypt. In Egypt, there were some journalists who could express themselves freely and some TV channels, but this wasn't the case in Tunisia. We used to have only mass media and media under the monopoly of the regime. So the unique space that we used to have used to be internet. So Today, internet is the chaos. It is like a battlefield between people with different ideologies. Yeah, it's good to have different ideologies, but how do we express ourselves? Today we see campaigns of hatred, of defamation, hatred discourses, and this is too bad. There are many rumors, misinformation. So I don't think that internet is really helping in the democratic transition, because we lost the control on it. So people who used to blog, to be cyber activists out of devotion, either abandon it or choose to be part of political parties or are working for, I don't know, businessmen or whatever. It's too different today.
I will first answer on the support. I think that the problems in Syria of what we are calling supporting some things or controlling an area, both things are similar in some way. Do people support the regime? If you organize any free space where they can answer, I will be there to listen to them. But until now, the regime just organized a repression that no places are enough, receive enough freedom in which you can speak freely, if you are in favor or not. It reminds me in somehow when you talk to the German soldiers at the end of the Second World War, and they were said, I'm in favor of Germany. Why? Russians are arriving. So, I mean, and somehow there's people in Syria who will say Assad could be part of the solutions, but there's still a mukhabarat just behind him. So I'm not sure that it's his own opinions or not. And if we are looking on the grounds, even the other white people started to refuse to go to the army, which is the best example of the support, I think, in favor of Assad solutions. On the other side, and that's a very important thing, you talk about cyber activists on nowadays and their roles. I think it's part of one of the great problems for Syria. We are not interested in Syrian civil society anymore. It's not, I mean, it's not beautiful. We are interested in jihadists on one hand and Assad. Everything else, we are not listen to them. It's not, I mean, there's hundreds or thousands initiative from citizens on the grounds doing what they can to organize the life, real and virtually. I will just take an example. There was a new drama organized by Nawal Bulbul called Romeo and Juliet. Romeo is in Amman, Juliet is in Homs. And through Skype, you can have this play organized. That's very, I mean, the symbol is very easy. It's to show that through culture and Skype, you can break down all the borders. Actually, the kids, because it's kids who are Romeo and Juliet, the kids who are represented Juliets are in the last quarter in Homs under the blockade of the regime. So that's the only problem for the play. It's only at 3 p.m. you can organize because it's the only time they've got electricity. But that's one of the examples. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of initiatives. But if you look at to the Western newspaper or Asian newspaper, compared to ISIS or compared to anything else, it's not interesting. We are just looking at Palmyra destructions. We are not looking at what white helmet organization in Aleppo who provide services for more than, let's say, hundreds of thousands inhabitants. I don't know why.
Thank you for your kind words. And yes, I would totally agree with you that there's much to be said about the sociolinguistics of humor during the Egyptian revolution. First of all, of course, like the role of humor is amazing, and of course one of the cultural traits of Egyptians. And in a lot of those language plays, we do see the kind of creative use of language that I was talking about here. Like it's not either or. Very often it's drawing on the polysemy or drawing on both Fusha and Amiya, or the incorporating English or mixing the two. I mean, I can give you one example that kind of shows how that creativity can be pushed even further, in a sense where, similar to this final slide that I had with in Al-Ghadab al-Sati' Atin, there is the same people, you know, they have like a series of these interesting T-shirts. One of them refers to the Egyptian, or actually Arabic, proverb that goes along, like the translation would be, when cats are away, mice play. And in so what they did, they took it in the standard form, but replaced the words from the Arabic for cat and mouse. So what you got is in ghab al-kat il'ab yarat. So which rhymes even more than ghab al-ut il'ab yafar. So the Egyptian saying, or like the proverb, Arab proverb, is taken, like reappropriated and expressed in this kind of multilingual or translingual way. And this is what I mean by translingual practices, where various resources are used in such a way that it's not like, oh, how well you know English, how well you know standard Arabic. No, whatever it is that you know, you draw on that as resources in order to achieve some kind of creative effect. And that's, I think, is very, I mean, it's amazing to see in graffiti, in revolutionary banners, and in everything that, especially now that spaces for expression seem to have shrunk in Egypt significantly from the days when I lived there throughout the revolution and after the revolution.
So I have a comment/question for Ivan. A year and a half ago, I was in Kuwait and teaching, and a young man came into my classroom wearing a T-shirt that said FBI Female Body Inspector. I didn't know what to do. I was so distracted the entire class because I wanted to know, like, does he know what he's saying here? Is he sending me a message, or should I make him take it off and turn it inside out? So my question is really about sort of like cultural competence and mastery. And I thought all your examples were like so sophisticated that definitely there was a game being played and they were like masters with a chessboard. But I wonder how widely sort of accessible are some of the messages. I mean, the Shit Happens T-shirt, for example. Like, what type of competence do you have to participate in these games, and are they intentional, or do you find like the appropriation of like a female body inspector T-shirt that, you know, it's just sort of borrowed to be provocative? And I just wondered if you had any comments.
Well, yes, I mean, I agree. I mean, there is a limit to how far we can generalize about these things, and, you know, like taking them as like, oh, these outbursts of creativity. And I remember when as I was finishing my doctoral dissertation, and I would be sending bits of it to my supervisor, and then he would be like, oh, this is all so exciting, but what about the rest of Egyptian society? You come up with all these like cool like examples from, you know. And I agree. I mean, some of it is quite sophisticated, as you said, and of course there's still large population that does not participate in these literacy practices, as I call them. But on the other hand, what I see important is that exactly this, that some of those who are engaged in the change, in you know, as we had in the previous panel, like pushing the envelope further, are expressing themselves in those ways. And now, for example, I'm mapping these instances of creative use of multiple resources within one word as shop names in new establishments in Cairo. And of course, the majority of them come from Zamalek, which is the the posh, expensive, high-class neighborhood of Cairo. But I did find some as well in around Ataba, which is not as well off. So these things do get picked up by people, especially because we are talking about this kind of fragmented or like not so much like orthography, more like heterography or allography, like the different ways of expressing something, like finding the your way in saying something. And of course, I mean, I don't know about the female body inspector, but I know that quite a lot of Egyptians would say like, oh, do you know what Egyptian IBM is? Inshallah, bukra ma'alish. So that is something that is picked up by quite a lot of people.
Said Ivan, I'm very amused by your presentation. Since you're an expert in classical Arabic and colloquial Arabic, I would like you to translate one famous saying in Egypt. But I will say it in Arabic first. I think فَمِنَ الْمُسْتَحْسَنَ أَنْ يكون ترجمة معنويا مش حرفيا. That's one. Number two is الدنيا فنيا والزمن كباس. I'm not good in the Amiyah. So you translate for me.
Well, I mean, like it would take me some time to come up with a translation that would not be like that literal. But do you have any question, like following on that, or?
My question is that you've missed that semi-classical Arabic, which is being widespread in the Middle East now. Mm-hmm. They're not using classical Arabic, semi-classical Arabic. Mm-hmm. And the Egyptians speak very good semi-classical Arabic as compared to Tunisians or Algerians or Libyans even. So that's my comment. It's missing from your presentation.
Well, of course, I mean, like in sociolinguistics, we usually talk about this kind of diglossic continuum. So from very classical Arabic, which I agree you find in maybe religious TV programs and in recitations of the Quran, and that's about it, to some kind of more modern Fusha, and then going to levels of dialect, or how colloquial a particular and we know that from every language. So, for example, the driver of the microbus does not speak the same Egyptian Arabic as university professor when the university professor speaks at home and speaks Egyptian Arabic. But the point is that nevertheless, I mean, whatever we call modern standard Arabic, or like in terms of grammar, in terms of syntax and morphology, it has not changed so much from the classical times. Yes, there are certain simplifications, there are certain lexical innovations, because language has to follow up with the contemporary world, but situations like lan atruka versus mish atruk, these are two, lam aktub versus ma katabtish. These are two obviously different grammatical systems at play. So this is what I mean, like when I refer to these two. But I totally agree with you that there are levels, and a lot of Arabic linguistics aimed at identifying those levels, which I am against of, because I think like the linguistic performance cannot be captured in those either or terms, but should be understood more in terms of fluidity and permeability of the systems. And this, the question, who speaks better? Standard Arabic is a contentious issue, a very contesting issue among the Arabs. I personally don't think that Egyptians have a very high, I don't want to insult Egyptians who are here, but on average Egyptians don't have very high knowledge of Standard Arabic. Syrians do.
So I'm sure you have questions. I have one personally. So if I may go back to the notion of public sphere, but I would like to articulate this, if you allow me, with the notion of, call it private sphere. Because, for example, if I refer to the notion or to the existence of humor, I don't know if there is an Arab sense of humor, but there is political understanding in the Arab world of humor, maybe. So, for example, the idea that among families, among your your friends, and especially among youth and so on, the idea that before political engagement, political authority is challenged, is struggled on the base of, let's say, on a day-to-day socialization, for instance, through humor, through nukta, the fact that the point that actually the nukta is a way to resist in the Arab countries, in North Africa, in the Near East, in the Gulf, maybe in Egypt, as you have shown. So the idea of a private sphere, preceding actually politically, being a political stage before moving to the public sphere stage. So what do you think of?
Again, I'm not sure. I mean, like, if I understand correctly, like whether the joke and humor should be placed entirely in the sphere of private, and especially in a context like Egypt, because I think it constitutes a very important part of socialization. That's true, but in like within the realm of home and family, but it's also quite present out there in the public. I mean, like, among the most popular actors in Egypt are the comedians. You usually have, the most, whether it's Adil Imam, who was forgiven for his kind of role at the beginning, or words at the beginning of the revolution. I don't think anyone actually cares about it anymore in Egypt. To those who like Tunisian Ahmed Makki, right? He's not even Egyptian, but he's making like this fantastic career in Egypt. But there is something I agree that. If your question also has to do with the fact that very often the dissent is going to be kind of laughed away through a joke rather than necessarily immediately being like screamed out. That I do agree that could be seen as one of the kind of subversive cultural mechanisms that are at play in many Arab societies. That's true. By telling a joke, you do kind of express certain ambivalence, certain dissatisfaction. But then, of course, we could also talk about the other things like in Egyptian culture, like gossip and conspiracy theories. But that would lead us into whole new domains.
Hello. This is to Lina and Matthew, the question, because considering Mr. Ivan's, like what he spoke about, and yesterday there was a lot about sharing between countries that had taken place, during the revolution, things to do, things not to do, and so on and so forth. So specifically with regards to humor, does that play a role in the Tunisian context and the Syrian context? If not, why? And if yes, like how much of a role, and the dynamics? Would you be able to simplify that, like, if possible?
Yes, I think that the humor played an important role in the Tunisian online activism. As I explained it, for example, for the demonstration against censorship, we relied too much on humor to attract people because people prefer humor to be interested in such causes. So we used the humor, and even within the revolution, when it comes to online activism, humor was present. Yes, it's part of the cyber activism sphere.
In Syria, definitely humor was great importance, but as an activist from Aleppo answer on this, the regime destroyed the capital of the joke, who was Homs. So all the Syrians started to make some joke. And on the cyber activists, you can see that, all kinds of regime propaganda was turned to another things. For example, if you change from the minister, you will see on the both sides Assad, or Assad in a giraffe because he got a long neck, or anything like this. And that was part of the political purposes of the revolutionary activist, is to show that in the revolution you've got life, and in the life you've got love, which is not on the other side, which is you have to fear the regime, and you have to shut up. So they just say, we will answer by any kinds of things.
So thank you very much to all of you. Thanks for your very exciting questions.